This operating system has been in development for the last 2 years, Julia, but it's really become a lot more important recently because of this trade war. I'll get into that in a second, but just to talk about the operating system for a second here, it's not going to show up on Huawei's smartphones right away. They say they're going to do that over the next 3 to 5 years. Really, you're going to start seeing it more on what they're calling their smart screens, which will debut later this year. You might see it on smart watches that Huawei makes and even in in-vehicle systems. So this operating system is going to be rolled out slowly over time, it looks like, but this all comes back to this trade war because remember, it was back in May that the Trump administration placed Huawei on an entity list, which basically forbade U.S. companies from selling their technology to Huawei. Huawei needs key U.S. technology to operate, including Google's Android operating system, which is what Huawei's smartphones run on. Basically now, Huawei can only use the open source or the public version of Android and can't use the Google apps like Google Mail, like Google Maps. And so that was a big deal for Huawei. So this operating system is basically a hedge, Julia, against Huawei needing U.S. products in order to make its own products competitive.
And there's so much, so little clarity around what the relationship's going to be going forward, particularly with companies that supply Huawei. But what we heard yesterday from the White House was, as far as federal contracts are concerned, they're going to tighten the grip here.
Yeah, and not only that, but Bloomberg has been reporting this week that the White House was considering at one point, which we had knew was public knowledge, that they were going to loosen some of those restrictions on private U.S. companies like Google providing technology to Huawei. Well, Bloomberg is reporting that the White House is going to delay restarting some of those relationships. And so Huawei is this puts a big question mark over Huawei's future. And I think this just goes to show you that there's no short-term deal in place for Huawei, no immediate relief as this trade war drags on with no end in sight, Julia. Companies that are caught in the middle, not only Huawei, but companies like Apple or Intel, these are all examples of private companies that are going to continue to get hurt from this trade war.
These are big numbers, and the costs do seem to be mounting for Boeing when it comes to the 737 MAX crisis. Let's take a look at the bill that they've talked about so far. That $4.9 billion charge, they say, mostly related to customer compensation and concessions. Add to that, also announced yesterday, $1.7 billion in costs related to production delays. Also another, on top of another $1 billion they announced in the first quarter. And they didn't even mention yesterday, Julia, the $100 million fund they've set up to compensate customers. So the numbers really are growing, but as I said, this is extremely fluid. I think it's telling that the company hasn't updated its 2019 guidance yet. They said again yesterday they're not ready to do that. We've got a lot of wild cards. They haven't presented the software fix to the FAA yet. The Boeing official has told CNN to expect that around September. And after that, there are even more uncertainties. What will the global regulators do? Will they follow in the footsteps of the FAA? So there's a lot of uncertainty around these forecasts. But I think the reason why we see the stock up today is that Boeing is trying to get out in front of this to kind of ring fence the risk around this problem and to reassure investors that it's doing that.
Is a currency war the next front in the US-China trade war? Well, that's what some investors fear after China allowed the yuan to drop to its lowest level in a decade. For the first time since the financial crisis, the yuan slid past the symbolically important level of 7 won to the dollar. And the Trump administration responded, labeling China a currency manipulator. Now, although that's a largely symbolic move, the designation dramatically escalates trade tensions between the world's two largest economies. China, for its part, says it's not manipulating its currency. The country's central bank says trade protectionism and fresh tariffs have led to a fall in the value of many global currencies, and that's also meant pressure on their currency, the yuan. But unlike the United States and other developed nations, China has far more control over the value of its currency. It sets a rate every single day, and the currency is only allowed to move 2% up or 2% down from that point. China's also said it won't engage in competitive devaluations, quote, to deal with the trade dispute. But it is one way China can retaliate against President Trump's tariffs on its goods. Weakening the currency makes China's exports cheaper, and that blunts the impact of tariffs. That's what the Trump administration insists China's up to here. But many analysts question that. They point out that China has spent billions of dollars buying its own currency to prevent it falling too much. And as the Chinese central bank said weakened growth has caused some of the other regional currencies to lose value versus the dollar since the trade war began. So it's kind of reasonable to suggest that the fall in the Chinese yuan could reflect the currency simply readjusting to the dollar's recent strength. But the big fear here is that it starts a deliberate currency war. What if the Trump administration tries to hit back by devaluing the US dollar? There have been mixed signals from the president about whether he would ever intervene like that.
I could do that in 2 seconds if I wanted. Well, I didn't say I'm not going to do something.
The key here is weakening the greenback would have serious risks. Not only the fact that it would mean less purchasing power for all Americans, and that would have repercussions across the entire global economy.